I need coffee. Wait. Okay. Let's talk about iRobot, and not the 2004 action blockbuster starring Will Smith.
Oh, hell no.
No, we are here to discuss the 1950 collection of interwoven robot fables written by titan of science fiction himself, Isaac Asimov. He is widely considered to be the most prolific science fiction writer of all time, with over 500 books credited to him and 383 short stories and God knows how many essays. The man feared no deadline or blank page. He was, you could say, a writing machine. Harlan Ellison, his friend and contemporary writer, once said of Asimov, he had writer's block once. It was the worst 10 minutes of his life. In this collection of robot vignettes, Asimov lays down the scaffolding for many of the tales of artificial intelligence we know and love today, from introducing the concept of the positronic brain,
until he tried to make Asimov's dream of a positronic brain come true.
A positronic brain.
To the now famous 3 laws of robotics, which have been repurposed and repackaged in countless classic science fiction tales.
It is impossible for me to harm or by mission of action allow to be harmed a human being.
iRobot is a fix-up novel, which Asimov published in 1950, where he gloms together a bunch of his short stories that were originally published in pulp magazines throughout the 30s and 40s. It uses a framing device where an unnamed journalist interviews famed robo-psychologist and frosty girl, Dr. Susan Calvin, about her 50-year tenure at a company called U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men. Through Calvin's recollections, we see Asimov's robots evolve from clumsy giants with slave complexes to entities of unfathomable superintelligence that can read minds, build space-time warping technology, and even usher in an era of peace and prosperity for humanity. The stories are a collection of puzzles and thought experiments that put the 3 laws of robotics through their paces, troubleshooting some of the flaws and weaknesses, exploring what might happen when they're misinterpreted or manipulated. We're shown how ambiguity can lead to glitches and logic can be sprung like a deadly trap. Susan Calvin is a bit reticent at first. She has to be coaxed into divulging details about her early days at the company. But by the time we get to the last few stories, Calvin is really starting to spill the tea. And yet, even with her confidential aside about possible robot Stephen Byerly, one gets the sense that she might still be holding out on us a bit. She is, after all, a company loyalist, even though they cut her out of certain high-level decisions like modifying the first law in the Nestor models of the Little Lost Robot story. Or perhaps it's less the company she's loyal to and more the robots themselves, which she calls a cleaner, better breed. And is she wrong? I mean, in Asimov's world, machines are not really the evil AI we see in so many modern movies. They don't harbor a secret hatred for their creators, and they're not waiting for a moment to rebel and take over the world. Instead, they're more like mirrors, reflecting back to us our own inconsistencies and contradictions. They're tools that sometimes behave in unexpected ways, but for understandable and explainable reasons. It makes sense that Susan Calvin would admire them. I will say reading visions of the future that are written so far in the past often gives me a kind of double vision, because you have Asimov's imagined techno-future superimposed on the actual future, which is our present. There's a charming retrofuturism about the idea of vacuum tubes and magnetic tapes and the Visivox plates and Visiplates or whatever they are, ultrawave technology and robots saying golly gee. But the real future, our present, is, as we know, not so quaint and certainly not a techno-utopia. And it strikes me that many of the questions Asimov's asking us to think about in this book would have seemed very remote and theoretical in his day, but are actually pressing on us with increasing urgency at this particular moment. Like, do we not currently find ourselves in need of some of the guardrails and regulations that Asimov proposes in this book? For instance, his solution to the problem of robots taking human jobs is simply to ban them from the Earth, send them out to space, and have them work on jobs that are too unsuitable or dangerous for humans to do. Which is a pretty elegant solution if you're already a spacefaring civilization, which of course we're mostly not, thanks in part to the post-space race slowdown in the wake of the Cold War, but I digress. And look, I realize there's likely no stopping ChatGPT from taking all of our jobs, but surely some kind of safety protocols could be put in place to ensure that we don't bring about our own extinction should a godlike superintelligence suddenly emerge from our shiny new toys and have an alignment issue. Right? Right? This book was published 75 years ago, and reading it, I was often unpleasantly reminded of that fact. Asimov is very much a white man writing in the 40s, so there's a conspicuous disregard for the personhood of almost everyone outside of that particular subject identity. The text often feels uncomfortably dated, and the writing can be stilted and cold. I noticed on some of the discussions over on Patreon and Discord of this book club, there's a tendency, maybe a temptation, to write this book off for many of those offenses and others. But say what you will about the writing and the characterization, it at least seems clear that Asimov was grappling more thoughtfully 80 years ago with the promise and pitfalls of AI than our world leaders currently are, even as we're racing to integrate it into every facet of our lives. We now have artificial intelligence that can do many of the things that Asimov only half believed were possible as he sat dreaming all of this up at his Selectric typewriter. But it's here. It's in our pockets, it's in our cars, our instruments of war, even in the unmanned rovers currently collecting samples for us on Mars. The things Asimov was writing about to thrill readers in the 40s are part of our daily news so often now that we barely stop to consider how fast the updates are coming and how radically everything's changing. And as we grant machines more control and access and authority over our affairs, how can we ensure that they do stay aligned with our interests? We don't have anything like the 3 laws. And even if we did, we have no way of ensuring that all of the chatbots and generative AI models that come out from the powerful players around the world would be universally encoded with them. So once the genie truly escapes the bottle, will we be able to integrate it into our society peacefully and usefully the way that the people in Asimov's techno-utopia did? Or will the other thing happen? I know this book can't really offer any of the answers here, but I do think it provides a nice framework for asking some of the right questions.
That, detective, is the right question.
I'm really grateful to this book club for giving me an excuse to read this book, which has been on my list for literally years, and I've never had a chance to read it until now, so thank you. And before my head starts to explode with too many questions that don't have answers, I'm going to come back down to earth now and host a conversation with my friend Grace Yost about the book. I invite you to use the chat feature to the right of the screen to share your own thoughts and join in on the discussion. And with that, let's get chatting. Okay, audio's rolling, videos are all rolling. Here we go. Welcome to Elle's Book Club. This is the full book discussion of I, Robot with my friend Grace Yost. She is a professor of music history. We met, though, as undergrads back at the University of Minnesota, both nerds who love sci-fi. And I actually credit Grace for getting me into Star Trek many moons ago. I had not seen it, and I was in my early 20s, and you grew up with it. So that was the beginning of a long journey for me of discovering sci-fi television anyway.
And then you got into the X-Files, so it's been a mutually
and then
beneficial.
Battlestar Galactica, and then,
which I haven't gotten into yet,
right,
but I will.
You should, and
yes.
I've been on you about that.
Absolutely. But yeah, Star Trek, and we've watched nearly every Star Trek piece
Other
of content.
than, I think I'm still working through Prodigy, and that's my last. And
Yeah.
a couple episodes left of Lower Decks, but yeah,
Right,
almost all
exactly.
of Star Trek that exists.
So now we are turning our ravenous appetites to the realm of literature,
Yes.
which Elle has read more of than I have, but I'm excited, as I hope everyone else is.
And you know, the whole point of a book club like this is to read more, scroll less, and have some good conversations. So with that, let's get into I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. So what did you think overall of I, Robot? I have a lot of thoughts, but...
Yes, I do, and we have sort of artificially not shared any of our thoughts with each other.
Which is unusual for us.
Right.
Usually Grace and I, if we consume the same thing, we're talking all along, but we wanted to save it for the cameras.
Yeah, well, okay, so I really enjoyed reading it. I mean, there are lots of things to say. I thought the anthology style was fascinating. Yeah, but yeah, what about you? What did you think?
Yeah, so I had read the Foundation series, so I was somewhat familiar with Asimov's writing style, which I find a little challenging just because it's so dry and so straightforward. I think somebody in the Discord might have mentioned this. It feels like a collection almost of parables, and sometimes geared even toward children. Like, I think there's a simplicity of writing, but a complexity of ideas that I found interesting.
This is definitely, there's sort of a drier writing style, and the way I can tell that is it's kind of hard to picture the characters and even the robots, and they're just like little details that he'll fixate on. Like, I think it's is it Powell with his long-suffering mustache? I can picture that, and then Donovan has red hair or something. Did I make that up?
He makes a lot of the red hair, yeah.
Yes.
You redhead, you.
Yes. Or then Dr. Lanning has eyebrows, and then Susan Calvin, I think, will probably have a lot to say about that particular characterization. But yeah, there's just like less, it's just sort of broad brush strokes, like that's that person, and, you know, there's more of an interest, as you said, in these ideas, and perhaps less in giving me, it's hard for me to picture some of the robots, but maybe that could also just be me because I'm less so sort of mechanically minded, but yeah.
And I think with the characters, it was fun to see the recurring characters, like whenever they brought in Powell and Donovan, it was like, oh, these poor guys, what are they going to have to go through now?
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
always on the front lines, working at the kinks.
That was interesting, because I thought that based on the first story that, oh, this is all going to be very different characters, even though Susan Calvin does pop up in the first story very briefly. But then, yeah, Powell and Donovan are the sort of the links between several of them. It's interesting also that we go from the outside of the company, like further into the power structure that is governing the entire planet. Like we start very remote, and then these missions outside, it's like space stations, and then we end up in the hub of the centralized government. And we learn more about the people who are controlling the company as we go through the collection.
And the scope of the stories broaden as the stories
Yes.
go on. So Runaround, you know, takes place on Mercury. It's those initial, you know, forays into extraterrestrial development. And then from there we go, now the last story ends up being about the machines kind of being in control of the entire world and the economy.
And possibly being, whatever we think of Stephen Byerly, so he's maybe like the ruler or the leader of the world, and then also...
And possibly a robot.
Possibly also a robot himself, yeah. So it's an interesting trajectory. That's why the first story is maybe a little bit of an outlier.
Yeah.
It's a sort of like, what if a human child had affection for like a robot? What would that be like? And then the rest of them are sort of more specific pressure exerted in various points on the three laws.
One thing I thought was interesting, though, about Robbie, the story, is that he kind of imagined a world where these kids get attached to these robots and really technology, and then they're less social, which felt very right. You know, in our time, this is what's happening with social media. We find that Gen Z and younger, these kids are like not going out as much. They're not, to some extent, they're not developing in-person relationships as much because they have technology to mediate through. And I wonder if it'll be increasingly the case with these AI, you know, chatbots and things, if we'll find that very thing to be true.
Well, people are already falling in love with the AI interface.
So he's kind of anticipating that because she shows little interest in meeting other kids her age, and that's the concern of the parents. And so I was almost kind of on the mom's side. I was like, I know, if I feel like I would also be concerned.
But then there's that other thing. It kind of reminded me of Terminator 2, Judgment Day, which is there's a, you know, of course, in the, you know, not to get off topic, but, you know, obviously the Linda Hamilton character Sarah Connor has bad experiences with the Terminators, and then that's the one where the Terminator has been, you know, one of them is like a good guy, and then she has this little meditation, I think it's through voiceover, where she's like, but this guy will never hurt my son. He'll never let him down. He'll always be there. He's perfect. And that's, I think, a recurring theme in the book, or certainly the belief of Susan Calvin and maybe some other people, where it's like, but they're set up. There's some, like a good, or in the Stephen Byerly story, it's like, you have these laws, you are a good person, you know? There's no harm that can befall this child because of that. And that's, the husband kind of engineers that artificial little... Well, he didn't know, right? He doesn't know that there's going to be an accident on the floor. But, you know, it's 100% dependable, this artificial life form.
Yeah, and in general, throughout the stories, Asimov's view of these robots is... His view of artificial intelligence in general feels optimistic to me. It's not this doom and gloom, like, you know, Skynet, world takeover. There's a question at the end, sort of, that last story. But overall, it's like he has this view of artificial intelligence that if you were to regulate it, if you were to program it correctly, then it could be this powerful tool. And though there might be little kinks we have to work out, but overall, robots are a force for good.
Right.
And anything that goes wrong with them is really our fault, you know?
Right. Yes.
So I hadn't realized that when I was going into this story. I was kind of imagining it would be a story of artificial intelligence take over, and it's not that at all.
No, and maybe that's because that is exactly what happens in the movie version.
Yes.
The movie version, which I think we both rewatched.
Yes, iRobot 2004.
From 2004,
Yeah.
indeed. And it says, I was watching into the credits, it says suggested by this, which it is obviously only dimly suggested by that. But they do have they have their own little story, you know, so it's better than you think it's going to be. When I thought I was going to read this and then think the movie was totally lame, like just a lame action version of this.
And it kind of is.
Well, it has parts of that, yeah.
It's a less nuanced view
Yes.
of robots.
Right. At its weakest, it is reminiscent of things like Die Hard, which I enjoy. But it's like, you know, every man who's like, and you're on his side, and then you're like, he's the one who sees them for what they really are, and it's anti-intellectual, those silly
Anti-technology.
Yeah, these silly elites don't realize like I've had this sort of like earthy, you know,
Real
man of the
world
people.
experience.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's like the least interesting aspects of that. But they do have their own interesting play. It could be like another short story, like the cop solving I suppose I shouldn't spoil the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it, but the idea, I guess we did already spoil it, but the idea of an artificial intelligence taking over, sort of like, okay, you know, we have seen that in a lot of other things.
Yeah.
And it's actually not really it's not the story that gets closest to that. The last one is so much more nuanced than this, where it's just like, clearly that's evil, you know, you shouldn't do that. So
They both result from the same reinterpretation of the laws, but in Asimov's final story, and we can talk more about that. I thought we would
Cool.
talk sequentially about the stories, but you know, the idea that the machines may deem the best case scenario for humans to be this complicated thing where they have to adjust little variables and we might not understand it, and in the end they take control for our good, you know. And that it's kind of a similar idea from iRobot the movie. It's just that I think iRobot the movie does it more sort of bluntly.
right. And I think, like, if I'm not mistaken, maybe I missed this, but for most of they don't have robots on the planet, right?
Right, I think that's the thing. They're outlawed.
Right.
They're only for extraplanetary research and work.
Right. The integration of robot and human life that we see in the movie is not part of this.
But the
short
machines, which are separate from robots, he has this idea that somehow computers are separate from robots, and I think Asimov does. So it's like the machines are in control. By the end
Right.
of the stories,
Right.
by the end of iRobot, the machines are in control of the world's economy and
Yeah.
possibly politics and.
But not actual robots,
But
or
not
it would be
robots.
a scandal. So that and that's why the first story does maybe feel a little bit like of an outlier, because that is thinking about, oh, what if a robot is like your kid's best friend? I forget the publication order, but I think the others seem more of a piece than the first one because of that. Because then you think, oh, will this be a thing where we're exploring robots taking over various human jobs? And not really. That's not. It's more of a meditation on these like 3 laws and how the brains of them would work and various challenges to those laws.
Right. Yeah, well, let's just go through each story and kind of talk briefly about each one.
This sounds good.
So we already kind of talked about Robbie. And then
Yeah.
there was Runaround, which I loved. I really liked Runaround.
Oh yes, Runaround.
I loved the Gilbert and Sullivan, the poor Speedy and his little loop and his Gilbert and Sullivan lines, which literally made me laugh out loud.
Yes, absolutely. And we meet Powell and Donovan, are sort of luckless hero. I guess they are. They do in fact get out of every scrape they're in, but they're like the testing grunts, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they also seem like the same person to me, but
Well, I think that Powell is like a little bit more. He seemed like smarter than Donovan, because isn't Donovan
a slightly weaker mind.
Yeah.
He almost falls for Cutie's
Right.
religious fanaticism.
exactly? Yes.
Yeah.
So, but they're not. I don't think Asimov is trying to give us these incredibly detailed portraits of the characters. I
Right.
think he's.
Well, he's just never has. It seems like in his stories, he's less interested in people and more interested in histories and
ideas
technology.
and-
And,
yeah.
So
Yeah, I loved that, Gilbert and Sullivan. And then I just found it interesting that it's like the way the order was delivered was confusing
Yeah.
to the laws. And then getting like stuck oh, I'll go close, but it's not worth me risking myself, and I'll go back out again. And
Right. Well, it's a glitch, basically.
Yes.
A glitch
Yeah.
that results from programming that's confusing. Like, what happens when you have these conflicting impulses and then you kind of get trapped in a loop? We take it for granted now that computers glitch and these things happen. But
Yes.
for him to think of this back in, like, the 30s or 40s, before computers were a thing,
Yes.
that were in every home. Yeah, an interesting image of those giant robots that are in storage because they're
Yeah.
immediately out of date. And I
Yes.
think that was true when he was saying, like, in the world of robotics, like, you design something 5 to 10 years go by and it's so out of date that it's
Yes.
like almost irrelevant.
But then they can also, like the ending of the story is sort of amusing because he's trying to get, now I forget, is it Powell who goes out to try to get the robot to come to save him, but then the old model is like also coming to save him.
Yeah, it's like, no, not you.
Not you, I'm trying to get this guy off his loop. Yeah.
Yeah, the slave complex thing was one of the many cringy moments where it's hard to read. It's like, what about this, boy? And it just strikes you as just uncomfortable. And then it raises questions of how many allowances do we make for context and
Right. If you're reading it today, it's very hard not to think about, okay, this kind of rhetoric being used to describe people of color, especially like specific terms coming up. And then there isn't really anything in here that is like thinking about their rights to be treated better. And there isn't really a question there.
there's
in
a
the same
sense
way.
that it's the natural order of things, that this is how
Yeah.
we should treat them, we should
Right.
we shouldn't consider robot rights or anything. I just think it's like an uncomplicated, like, of course they would be our slaves.
But then I guess like the one complication is in the zealot story where the robot's like, well, of course I'm superior to you.
I thought that was so funny. Like, periodically you pass into a coma. Like, let's be real. I'm
So,
superior.
Look at me, yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
And he's not wrong in some ways.
but then you see the other attitude where like, oh, of course you'll just serve us. And maybe to be fair to Asimov, at the end, there's, I mean, at least like Susan Calvin seems to think it's okay if we have machines, I guess not robots, but machines kind of making large decisions for us.
Well, she even says
know.
robots because she doesn't mind Stephen Byerly
Right.
operating in the world in the most powerful position in the world.
Right. Like, no, that's going to be fine. And then I think there are reasons for that go into her characterization. But yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some of the slave complex, the like master thing, you're like, so.
Right. And then we have the 3 laws of robotics mentioned for the first time in detail in Runaround. Just going
Right.
back to Runaround for a
Right.
second.
Just, I was interested in and this happens in a couple stories, the way the orders are delivered will affect the priority that they are assigned.
Yeah, I think he calls it positronic potentials. So it's like you
Oh,
have
yeah.
a stronger potential for the first law. It's interesting how he puts it out there because you can see it distance-wise.
Yes.
You can actually see it in the physical world, how his positronic potentials are working. Keeps him physically in a loop because he
Yeah.
tries to run away from the danger and then he's like, nope, my orders are this.
But the
Yeah.
order was given just in a kind of like,
Yeah.
just go do that, and then
And you decide how important
Right.
that is. Yeah.
instead of like, this is life or death,
Right. Also, speaking of positronic potentials, the term positronic he came up with, which
I was wondering that.
Yeah.
That's like everywhere.
the positronic brain, like Data has a positron
Data, yeah,
in Star
exactly.
Trek. But the positron, I was kind of reading that the positron was, it's the antimatter equivalent of an electron, and it had
Oh.
just been discovered maybe like a decade or less before he wrote these stories. So it was like a buzzword in the scientific community. So just mysterious enough and just familiar enough that you could use that as a technology for developing a brain,
That's
an
really
artificial
cool.
brain.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that. That's really interesting. Yeah, Speedy was very endearing.
One of the most endearing out of all the robots, I would say, Speedy was.
Yes,
With his little Gilbert and Sullivan lines.
yes,
And just
absolutely.
trying to carry out his little orders. What was the one after that?
Reason
Okay.
with Cutie.
With
Cutie
Cutie.
the Zealot.
Yeah, interesting that a robot trying to understand its existence would basically go back to where Descartes ended up. I think, therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
He found the same sort of baseline platform to begin his little ontology.
And based on that, like nothing, there's a very controlled environment. I guess that's a utility, like we were saying, of it's not taking place on Earth. There's nothing. It's just a sealed environment. You wake up and then you're this obviously advanced technology, and then you have people telling you things, and then and then you have your own little conspiracy theory going.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
They had the skepticism dial turned up a little bit too high on him.
Right, but it doesn't actually matter in the long run because he'll do his job.
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing.
It was very much a parable, it felt
Right.
like. And like I just feel like maybe it wouldn't be very likely that this would all that the robots would all convert to this sort of cult like religion, and it was an interesting thought experiment, but maybe not so realistic.
Yeah. Like that doesn't Donovan think like, well, maybe it's like he
That
kind
was
of
maybe
gets-
the most interesting moment of the
Yes,
story, when Donovan
true.
is like momentarily wondering if it was possible that he was actually the one who had been programmed with false memories,
Right, exactly. And
and
then
how quickly you could get to that point.
he's been gaslit by Cutie.
Right.
Yeah, he says, "Say, Greg, you don't suppose he's right about all this, do you? He sounds so confident that
Yeah, and then again he wonders later after that too. Whereas Paul's like, you fool.
Right.
You'll see very, very soon how real Earth is when the relief comes, and
Right,
we have to
yeah.
explain what happened here.
I don't know. It's a sort of like, it's a very skeptical view of religion. That this is kind of a level of control in a certain way, that they think they're serving the beam machine or whatever that is.
Yeah, and then in the end, it's like, well, does it matter what they believe? Just let them believe that as long as they're accurate.
Yeah.
You know, and you could take the same view with religion. If people are part of a religious fanaticism, a religious cult, then as long as they're not hurting anyone and it's helping them,
Yep.
just let them. Who cares? You know.
Well, right, or that's a sort of a lot of rhetoric in like certain religious sects is like, well, you'll be rewarded later, so do work really hard and then you'll get your payback in the next life or something. The point is to get them to work hard, and
Right.
then that's a very effective belief system for that, and that seems to be what's going on with reason.
I did wonder why Donovan and Paul didn't just brief the next people. It's just like, oh, they'll figure it out. Why? Why not just tell them?
I know, yeah,
It seems a little rude.
that's true, yeah.
I would have left a little note at least, and
That you're walking into a cult,
Yeah.
and they won't listen to you,
right.
which is kind of
and they see you
alarming.
as an inferior being, and
Yes.
maybe just a heads up would have been nice. But
There's like no camaraderie among like the company. Everyone seems to be at each other's throats.
well, you just in general, you just don't get you don't have relationships as much between characters, and then when you do get them, like in Liar, you almost wish they weren't there. It's like, get back to the robots, please.
Yes, exactly. I don't want to be reminded of
Yeah.
the actual social context here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we'll get there. What's the next story?
We've catch that rabbit.
Oh yeah, Catch That Rabbit. So this was my least favorite story, and I'll tell you why.
Please.
I
Yeah.
feel like this one the entire story was just a setup for a pun at the end of the story. And anyone who's watching this probably knows that I love puns. I'm a master of puns. I've built my whole online presence around puns.
That's true.
It could be said.
It could be said.
Love a good pun, but I just feel like the whole story, it was like, and then it was all lead up to that line about he was twiddling his fingers. Or what, twiddling his thumbs? I don't know.
That's well, right. Like I agree with your critique. So isn't the setup that the robots, like when they leave them to their own devices, Dave just like he won't complete the tasks unless he's being supervised.
I think the issue was that there were 6 fingers or something
Right.
like that, and there should have been 5. Like, there's an optimal amount of fingers. There's an optimal amount of subsidiaries, and if you go over that or if it's unbalanced, then you'll get these like glitches, basically, right? And then all they needed to do was take out one of the fingers, and now it's like this perfectly balanced, calibrated, hand. But again, I really think that he was just setting it up for that pun.
Well, it's also like so when you're freaking out, you're twiddling your fingers is like something you do when you're bored.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I don't twiddle my fingers when I'm like
Yeah.
anxious.
Because that's the thing. Like he stops. And they at the beginning of the story, they're like, "Why have you stopped?" Like they leave, and he's overwhelmed, and then twiddling his fingers.
In a marching formation. It's unclear what the point was for me. And maybe
Right.
someone in the chat can
Maybe
illuminate that.
this is somebody's favorite, and they
Yeah.
can tell us we're wrong.
Tell
and
us,
why,
and I'm
yeah.
sure there's more to it.
Of course, there's more
Yeah.
to all of these, of course. But actually, this is my least favorite, Liar.
Liar? Well, yeah. Well, but I would say it's the most interesting, one of the most interesting of them, just in terms of like Susan Calvin's character.
Yeah.
But let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Liar, probably the most contentious.
Yes. And the story that reminds you that you're reading something that was published in 1950.
Maybe more than any of the others.
Yes,
In
exactly.
1950, was it not in the 40s?
So the story, I'm thinking of the collection, but I think that the stories are from
The late 30s, early 40s.
in the 40s, yeah.
Yeah.
So even earlier than that.
So
yeah.
would it surprise you to be told, I looked this up, Liar, he revised it for this collection to make Calvin more human and like less of a sexist depiction of women. He took out things that were even... He didn't revise it too heavily, but he changed a couple words like dame to lady and
Oh, okay.
that kind of thing.
I
I'll put a
understand.
link for anyone who's interested in the description to the original version of this story, which is maybe a little bit even more problematic. But yeah, let's talk about it. How did we feel?
Okay. Well, it might be worth thinking about, like, the frame, and perhaps if you have a candidate for main character in the story, it would certainly, in this entire collection, would be Susan Calvin,
Yeah.
who is, like, the frame that's holding everything together.
She's a
Susan-
robo-psychologist, so it makes
Right.
sense that she would be in a great position to understand the robots and explain them to us.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And, to be fair to Asimov, like, this is in the 30s and 40s. No one is making you pick a woman to be the main character
Right.
and to have a job like robo-psychologist.
Yeah.
And yet it is kind of like it's a, it falls into this trope of like, oh, what's she gonna do? She's a woman and a professional, and how can she even do all that?
She can't really do it all.
She can't do it.
She's gotta, if she wants to be a scientist, she's going to be a spinster.
She will be a spinster. Nobody
Yeah.
wants that.
Nobody wants that.
Right.
Super unattractive. Yeah.
I thought, like, in the frame, I wrote this down because it made me feel seen. Let me find it. She was a frosty girl, plain and colorless, who protected herself against a world she disliked by a mask-like expression. She was a frosty girl.
Yeah.
As a frosty girl, I was like,
I can be a frosty girl.
a frosty girl. But things like that, or just like a number of times, especially in this story, she's an assemblage. She's not just like a woman with a job. There's like her identity as a woman and then her professional identity. And then it's just really hard for her to manage that combination.
And what's really hard for her, and every woman, I guess, from the 30s and 40s, like in a man's view, is really keeping her normal hysteria, which
Yeah.
is just built into her body, down
Yeah.
and suppressed. But it's really just when, if she's not careful, it'll bubble up and just kind of take over. And that's really, just under the surface of any woman, there is that hysteria that's always threatening to take over. And in Calvin's case, that was the last time that she buried it for good,
Yes, exactly. And then, that is like, you have three people whose wishes are being, the mind-reading robot and has identified each of their desires. Dr. Lanning desires to be smarter than the robots and will be flattered by the fact that Herbie cannot do calculus or something. Dr. Bogart wants to be the director. We have like the desire for intelligence, the desire for professional power, and then we have the desire for love.
Yeah,
of course, it's love.
And this is his first story with Susan Calvin, so that he developed this character probably as a plot device, really, for this relationship that he wanted to explore. So that's how Calvin came to be. And then it's later that he sort of develops her character more.
Right.
And he also developed this character and wrote this story before he got married and really had any relationships with women. And he went to a boys' school and then a boys' college. Columbia back in the day was not co-ed. So he had no experience with women. He probably struggled to see them in a complex light. Couldn't imagine a woman who might have like career ambitions and also just be a well-balanced person, you know? So this story more than any other shows sort of where he starts out and his views of women, and then later we see more complexity, I would say, in Dr. Calvin, but not terribly much.
No, but also, and it's I think good to keep in mind the context. So you said, I think I remember like the publication dates of these are late 30s into
40s.
the 40s. Okay, so this is a time period, the 30s and the 40s in the U.S., where women it's like okay for them to be part of the workforce during the Great Depression. It's like, hey, get out there, and like if you're out there trying to work to support your family, that's okay. Think about Superman, created 1938, if I'm not mistaken. Lois Lane has a job from the start. She's a reporter, and that's fine,
Right.
And then during World War II, obviously, we have to have people doing all these jobs.
Chipping
the
in.
men are serving. So you endorse that. But there's always, if you watch a lot of media from this era, as I do, I watch, this is like films and television, there's often this kind of conflicted thing like, what if they stay here? Will there be a breakdown in society? And this
What
is
if they accumulate any kind of real power?
right.
Yeah.
And like what if exactly. What if they want to continue being leaders? Will we have to change all of our gender norms? And so then we have this kind of like hard right into the conformity culture. Domesticity becomes a sort of new ideal in the 50s. So there's a radical moment where we might have changed gender roles in the 30s and the 40s. That is, it's like we declined that and we went into a different ideal. So these kind of anxious, like fraught depictions of women in these positions, there are a lot of them. That's just a long way of saying that. It's not like he's not like uniquely coming up with this.
This is a type. This is
Right.
a type that was circulating at the time, especially, and
Right.
and continued to circulate, really.
Yes.
The repressed, career-obsessed woman who, she has shriveled ovaries and she,
Right.
yeah.
And it's like there's something unnatural. You're not fitted to do these types of things. Not to speak about Star Trek all the time, but we could.
I think we can. We're among friends. I would say.
We're among friends. Like the original series, if people have seen, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it the last episode where there's the body swap with Captain Kirk and then a woman who so longs to be captain? But that's like
I remember that episode. I can't remember where it fell, but
And the whole thing is like this irrational woman, she just can't be a leader.
Right.
And like that you're unsuited for that role. But and this is like in the 60s. So,
right.
2
decades after this was
Right.
probably written.
it is a bummer to read that,
Yeah,
obviously.
it's a bummer.
upsetting. And then but actually, sorry.
It's that trope of like the hell hath no fury like a woman scorned,
Well, right. And at the end of this, like her vicious revenge was just like shocking to everybody.
And so out of character, honestly, for Dr. Kelvin.
Well, the whole thing seemed like, I don't know, her obsessing over this like doofus guy. It just seemed, I was like, I don't relate to that. I Frosty girl. I was like,
Yeah, where's the frostiness?
Where's the frostiness? Yeah,
well,
I
this is the explanation for how she got to be Frosty, I guess. But
I thought that Frosty girl, she's like she's already Frosty because she's
right. Well,
she was at the seminar. This is at the age of 20. She's at the seminar, the psychomath seminar,
and she's at
already
15,
Frosty.
sitting
Yeah.
alone, writing her little essays, and
Yeah.
this is the woman I identify with.
I know exactly.
But
yeah,
I think again, this is his first. This is the first appearance of Dr. Calvin, and I think he just kind of thought of her as a plot device. And this is a woman who,
Right.
in this space dominated by men, would have to. The only way that she can be in that space is to eradicate any femininity or any feminine desires from her body, and something has to sort of spark that.
right.
So getting rejected by a man would be enough to then push her into sort of an unnatural, unfeminine role for the rest of her life.
And that is one thing I'll say that the movie is 100% better on, despite it. Obviously, we talked, it's not the same, but I think their version of Susan Calvin is much more successful.
It's interesting, though, of course, that they cast a literal model to play her when in the book she's described as very plain and
Right. That's true.
yeah.
But everyone's always hot
Yeah.
in these Hollywood films.
Yeah.
But I just felt like they captured, because like Alfred Lanning and, Lawrence Robertson is like basically not in this. He's just
Right.
like mentioned, and then he's like this kind of menacing like Elon Musk figure in the movie.
Yeah.
So he is that kind of figure in this, and they don't seem really like based on the book characterizations, but she is, but she's just like feels like a more of a complete person, and she's not sort of damned for being intellectual,
Yeah.
Yeah. But I did think, okay, so that massive issue aside, it was interesting to think like, okay, maybe lying to you is what is best,
Yeah.
telling you what you want to hear.
It's a reinterpretation of the first law.
Right.
So that's interesting. Yet
Yeah.
another nuance we can add to our understanding of these laws and how they might function.
Right. I just kind of wish I 100% on board if her secret desire wasn't Milton Ash, and if she didn't have this sort of vengeful reaction, I think it would be a better story.
But at the crux of the story, the idea that the robot would interpret the first law in such a way that would lie is really interesting, and there are a lot of ramifications for that. Then
but do they ever explain how it is that he reads minds, or is that kind of like, well, it's complicated,
I think that's
positronic-y?
just imagine, yeah.
Yes,
In the same way that, like, you know, in the Foundation series, like how could someone really predict the future in any meaningful way based on an understanding of, you know, economics and all that? It's like, I think it's just something we have to imagine is possible in that world, and leave it at that.
If I'm nodding like this, does it seem like I've read the Foundation series?
No, that's fine.
I appreciate it. I'm sure you're right, but
Yeah.
you know, and it's on my list, of course. But
Yeah.
But that's cool. But that's like that kind of, you know, how the first laws apply. I guess I shouldn't say it's not my least favorite, but it certainly is like has my. How about it has like a really unfortunate moment in it?
It is a little unfortunate. Oh, I was going to say, I think there are a couple moments where Asimov, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is making comparisons between Susan Calvin and machines and robots. Like she herself feels kind of robotic. And
yes.
One really interesting moment I noticed in Liar was, like, if you're familiar at all with the term match cut, like in film, like if you do a match cut in between two shots, there'll be something in one scene that refers to something in the other scene, you know? So it's like, I noticed in this short story in Liar, there's a match cut sort of between, on page 94 of our edition, which is this one. Susan Calvin answered with a barely perceptible nod, but her eyes followed him out of sight. And then if you go down, it's like RB34's photoelectric eyes lifted from the book. We're invited to compare like her little robotic eyes with the robot's eyes. And I just think there are a lot of moments like that where we're invited to imagine that Susan Calvin, she's the perfect robo-psychologist because she herself has robotic tendencies. And
I love that. I didn't notice that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then her also, not only is she herself robotic, but she's the biggest fan of robots. I mean, with the tragic sexist reason, like, they'll never let me down, you know, but then they will not let you down.
Right.
Yeah, I like that match cut. It's cool. I also enjoyed the, like, that logic trap that feels like the solution in a Star Trek episode, you know, like, let's get the robot in a logic trap, you know?
Yeah, which is so again, just seems out of character for everything else we know about Calvin. She cares about these robots.
Yeah.
She tries to understand them.
Yeah.
For her to just murder one, basically, with this logical trap just seems a little out of character.
Yeah, and like everyone else is so disturbed. It is disturbing.
It is disturbing. You should, if you get a chance, you should look at the original version. Or maybe not.
Or not.
Yeah. It's not so much worse, but it is a little worse. Hey there, book clubbers. Elle here, interrupting our discussion momentarily to bring you to the observation deck. This is a perk on my Patreon where people can send in their thoughts on the book via text, voice memo, or video, and I might choose to include them here. Here's an observation from Desiree S. When I read this long ago, back in the 1980s, I really enjoyed it, but rereading it now, my tastes have clearly changed. I only really enjoyed one story, Little Lost Robot. Times have changed, and so have I. And now back to the discussion where Grace and I are about to get into Little Lost Robot. What comes after Liar?
Lost Little Robot.
Oh, yeah. So this is the fun mystery.
Oh, I like this one. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where we get to see Calvin's character is sort of redeemed in this one, I would say.
Yeah.
She gets to be the smarty pants that comes in and is like, she fools the robot into revealing himself. And
yeah.
Yeah.
And she's right where, like, there's that, you know, and she's frustrated, like, you shouldn't weaken. If you change the 3 law setup, then, like, the delicate balance that we have struck is going to be ruined and it's going to be dangerous. And she's totally right. Proven right at the end of the story where, is it Nestor 10?
Yeah, I think so. And that's, interestingly, the same, those are the models that you see in I, Robot, the movie, right? The Nestors.
Oh, yeah. I think they're like NS5s.
NS5s,
is the big
yeah.
thing. But it's a similar kind of designation.
There's that similar moment in the movie where all the nesters, there's like 1,000 of them, but then it shows up as 1,001, and then they have to try to get one to move and reveal himself.
Yeah, I think that was like, this is kind of an inspiration for that. Yeah. But Susan Calvin, the book Susan Calvin has a much more elegant solution. Although, doesn't she initially say, I think to be safe we should just probably destroy them and then
she does. Which
'Cause
is which is necessarily callous. It's
Right.
like, well, yeah, that's what you'd have to do, like with faulty equipment, you know.
Right. And then it's like the idea, once you have one law out of balance, and then he's going to start developing a different agenda, and he does try to kill her.
Almost
So,
like a virus.
yes.
Yeah.
And then it's going to, and he's already communicating with the others.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very ingenious trap that she uses
With
to
the
get him.
infrared
Yes.
versus the, what was it?
The gamma ray.
Yeah, so he had this extra knowledge that they didn't have.
Yes.
Yeah, and she exploited that.
Yeah. That's very crafty.
Yeah, it's ingenious. It's satisfying. It's a satisfying ending. We get to
Yes.
see Calvin at her best.
Because it's like the safety, like we don't always agree. I think she places a lot of trust in robots that, you know.
But she's willing to just cast out a whole group of them if necessary. You know, she's not blinded by her love of robots or anything.
No,
Yeah.
like that's, and then she's frustrated because they didn't, what's it, like the secret contract, they didn't tell her, and then, yeah.
Right.
And she's
it
right
is
to be frustrated.
strange that they wouldn't let her in on that, but
Maybe because it's like she is principled in her way, you know,
Yeah.
or very principled, you know, and would say what she said here, with like, you shouldn't tamper, because then you just, there's like they're striking a little balance between them, and if you weaken that one.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the three laws are like part of the structure of the positronic brain, right? So you can't, she says later when she's talking about Byerly, you can't make a robot that doesn't have the three laws built into it.
Oh.
It's like part of how the positronic brain is made. So it wouldn't function without the laws to allow
I
for any
forgot
kind of
that.
modification. Which feels right. I mean, it's almost like one wishes that were the case for our technology now. You know, we should have some sort of regulation where they have to follow certain
Right.
laws, you know? And yet we don't have that. This is a safer version of
That's true.
artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. And then they've protected the labor force on Earth in a way that they don't seem to be willing
Right.
to protect the actual labor force.
Yeah, and there are differing views on that. You know, some people say it's like, why don't we just follow technology wherever it may lead us, and we shouldn't be worried about archaic jobs. You know, we weren't worried about that when the sailboats stopped being
Sure.
our main form of transportation. But
I think this is more of an existential threat.
this will be a bigger sea
Yeah.
change than maybe any other technology.
Yeah, or just it's just very worrying, because they only get into this with the liar story, but like AI lying is a huge problem.
Yeah, and maybe not even intentionally lying, just hallucinating.
Yeah,
It's going to continue to be a problem.
People will trust it, and then
And it has its
Yeah.
own sources. It'll start referencing its own false sources, and then we're off to the races.
yeah, it's also much more sort of nightmarish, and maybe some positive things. I tend to be pretty negative about.
You're more
Yeah.
negative than I am. It was interesting to read this sort of more optimistic view of artificial intelligence, though, because I feel like everything I consume has been a negative view of it.
Right,
Like,
well-
you see just so much doom and gloom when you read, you know, some things in The Economist and Atlantic and New York Times, and it's just like a tale of doom and
Yeah.
like the end of humanity is how everybody's sort of treating it. So it's kind of nice to see, well, this is an alternate view.
Right. But like, maybe it actually could be an improvement. Maybe we'll use this intelligence to avoid war.
If we get it right, we could. Yeah.
Right. But I think he's sort of assuming a world unity that seems very far away.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an interview with him later in the 80s. I can't remember where he was in this interview, but you know, they asked him, what's your view of the future? What do you think it will actually be like, let's say in 500 years? And he said, well, I see two different futures depending on whether we solve our current problems by the year 2000. If we haven't solved our problems like climate change and war and all these things that we're facing now, I see a future 500 years from now where New York City is the greatest ruin, and it's a small collection of humanity living in, you know, the dregs of, you know, the past societies that flourished and sort of barely surviving. And then if we do solve those problems by the year 2000, I see a techno-utopia where we have eliminated a lot of war and disease, and we're exploring the galaxy, and, you know,
That's sad.
yeah. Unfortunate.
I don't think we did solve any of that.
No. But we've made some strides since
That's
his
true.
time, especially in the realm of climate change. But I have a long way to go.
Well,
So that's a sad banana.
that is a sad banana.
Yeah. So what's the story after?
Escape is next.
That was
This one was also kind of trippy with the brain.
the brain, right? Where Calvin gets almost motherly toward this brain.
Right, and then this vision of travel that necessitates a sort of death.
Yeah, this is a slightly confusing one to me.
Yes.
So this is the death that anyone would experience when they do, like, say, in Star Trek with the transporter, where
I see.
you're
Yeah.
disassembled and then you're reassembled.
Okay.
And maybe that they hadn't worked out the technology yet here to make that a smooth transition.
Right.
It sounds like later they were able to tweak that so that the death that you experience when you jump through space and time
Yes.
isn't so rocky and you don't experience these. What I was confused about was the brain humorously giving them this experience of hell just as a joke?
Yes, I think so.
What tricked them into thinking they've gone to hell?
Yes, exactly. And then, his way of dealing with having this problem that is pressing up against the restrictions that he has.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so the practical joke that he plays on Donovan and Powell also extends to the ship itself, and how
Yes.
he gave them milk and beans. And
Yes.
Like, I guess I'm maybe missing the humor of the brain here a little bit. Like,
Well, it's also it's a child brain, so
yeah,
it's not.
it gets sulky and
Yeah, it's just not.
it's touchy. Yeah, interesting. I guess we get to see the space travel aspect of Asimov's world here in its infancy and
Right.
before they've worked out the kinks with the jump.
Right. So this is his version of warp. Of course, this is before Star Trek, but okay. So somehow, how do you get around this? What will happen to a human going that? Yeah, and then temporary death. Okay.
But we really get to see Calvin being her robot psychologist self. You know?
Yes, and explaining things, and
Yeah. I think just throughout his stories, the robots are maybe a little more human than one would imagine they would
Yeah.
really be. Like this brain, especially with its little by golly and gee and sulkiness and
yes,
touchiness. There's just so much obvious humanity in these robots, and I feel like you don't see that as much in other works.
Yeah, but I kind of think that the real version of this would be, you've seen Ex Machina, right? Where the robot does not care at all.
No.
It would just be ruthlessly following its own objectives,
Yeah.
and and we do. I mean, we have some threatening depictions of robots here, but there is. It's a much more positive vision.
And they just feel sort of human. All
Yes.
of them feel human in some way.
Yeah, from Robbie wanting to hear about Cinderella, Speedy, and Gilbert and Sullivan, and
Yeah. Which leads us to, what's the one after that?
Evidence. Oh, I loved this one. This is the Stephen Byerly one.
Yeah. One of my favorites.
Yes,
Do we think Stephen Byerly is a robot?
I do.
Yeah.
think so.
Calvin seems to think so.
Right, but then she's not troubled by this. She's troubled by, weakening the first law for those robots that she has to detect in that earlier story. But the idea of Stephen Byerly running for mayor here, yeah, the mayor, that's fine.
And then eventually coordinator.
running the world.
Yeah. Provided that a robot has the fully functioning 3 laws,
Yeah.
Calvin is not concerned at all.
Right.
As long as that's the case, then she fully trusts the robot to make good decisions for the good of humanity.
Absolutely. And then, and she mentions, it's, hard to tell if somebody's just, a really good person or if they're a robot.
Right.
That's programmed to be that way.
Which really shows how highly she thinks of robots.
Yes.
You can't tell the difference between a really, truly genuine and good person and a robot.
Yeah. But it's just kind of, I don't know. Because I think otherwise, if he's not a robot, what's he doing with that, teacher?
And why does he atomize himself upon death?
Yes,
There's no real
exactly.
reason.
But having him protect himself in that way and spar with Quinn was very satisfying.
Yeah, he's perhaps the most interesting character of all the stories. He and Calvin, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, so again, this is Asimov at his most optimistic, really, about artificial intelligence. This for Asimov is this is the ultimate robot. This is where we should end up if we're careful and we do it right. We get an equitable, reasonable, wise leader.
Yeah, he's incapable of, although I do wonder if I guess you'd have to zoom out. It's like what they talk about with the machines. It'd have to be, instead of, I can't hurt a human or allow harm to befall a human, you have to zoom out to humanity, because if you're a politician, even for a mayor, you would have to be able to tolerate people getting harmed by your policies. There's just no way that you could do that without tolerating some of that.
Right. Someone will get hurt as a result of any decision. It's kind of like how these autonomous cars have to make a decision about who's going to live and die in an accident situation.
Oh, do they already have to do that?
They already have had to program the cars to make these decisions, where it's like, do you save do they always privilege the person in their car?
Oh.
Or will they be okay with, making the sacrifice?
What is the answer to that?
I don't know.
Okay. Like, oh.
Yeah. And does it change if there are like children in the car and,
That's kind of like the 2004 iRobot movie. Weighing such things, like the importance of various human lives on the line,
Right. One of the reasons that Dell is so suspicious of them, because they don't care. They don't think about feelings.
Right. And that's an interesting perspective, actually. It's one of the stronger scenes of the film. It's interesting.
And this relationship between Dr. Calvin and Stephen Byerly feels the most intimate to me out of all the relationships between all of the characters, even Donovan and...
Well, they seem actively not to like each other.
Donovan and Paul are just thrown together all the time,
right.
Constantly bickering, but almost like an old married couple or
yes.
something. But Calvin and Byerly, there's an intimacy there between them. They respect each other, and they're interested in each other's thoughts, and so it feels like that dynamic relationship. Of course, it would be with a suspected robot. This is who she feels most at home with, in a way.
And also, like, the character in the book who's the most respectful of her.
Yeah, right.
Is the robot.
Yeah.
More respectful of her than the author,
Yeah.
But I think, it's kind of true. Yeah. And her dimension, and she just sees that, and then admires the, like, well, you could have just punched does he hit him in the face? I can't remember.
Yeah.
He hits but then maybe that's just a robot. Question mark.
If you did it once, you could do it again.
Yeah. I don't know, it's kind of reminiscent of, like, Blade Runner, like, who is a replicant and who is not, and how would you know, and, of course they go further because maybe you yourself don't know.
Right.
But Stephen knows.
Well, you don't carry your teacher around in this sort of intimate relationship.
No, I thought at first, I was like, is this going in a very surprising direction for 1950?
Very progressive.
And I was like,
that occurred to me.
Yeah, no, that I was like, huh. No.
Yeah.
I think it's literally more likely that this person is a robot than there's, like, a depiction of, like, a gay relationship like that, Otherwise, what is John? Is he going by John? Is that the teacher or / real Stephen Byerly who's been injured? And
so this makes John a person operating in a private sector, making his own robot. So he must have a lot of resources.
Yeah, somehow
secret
he had
lab.
access. Yeah, so that opens up the specter of, like, well, so is there a black market of robotic stuff happening on Earth? Probably.
Private ventures.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Somehow he had access, and somehow he grew a body around it. Is a little
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Somehow Palpatine returned. It is kind of like that, know. But I'll allow it because it's a short story, and
we only have time for so much explanation.
Right, and sometimes those explanations are kind of unsatisfying.
Yeah. I like that moment at the end in the frame, when the frame returns at the end of the Stephen Byerly story, where the journalist wants an answer. Like, is it true? And she kind of just says, well, what difference would it make? Who cares if it's true?
Yeah, you share a prejudice against robots, which is quite unreasoning. What difference would it make? Yeah.
So that takes us to the final story. What was it called?
The Evitable Conflict. Or, as I wrote in my notes, the Inevitable Conflict. Because you realize, like, that is never used. But then that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
In the context of the story.
Yeah, so basically in this story, you have Byerly, now the world coordinator, so in charge of the entire world, coming to Calvin and saying, we have a problem. The machines are functioning below expected optimal levels. So what does that mean? Why are they doing that? Could it be a problem of, like, the data that they're being given? Is that faulty? And so he goes and he interviews all the different regional coordinators. And then Calvin takes all of this in. I love that moment where he thinks she's asleep, but she's really just like synthesizing all the information. And then she explains, like, no, what's actually happening is that the machines are performing in exactly the way they need to get us to reorganize in a way that's most beneficial for humanity.
Well, and to get rid of that organization.
Yeah. So my understanding is that, according to Dr. Calvin, she thinks that, the machines are deciding to underperform so that there's an inquiry, and these people that are part of the machine opposition, the Society for Humanity and that other fundamentalists or whatever.
So, yeah, I think they're an outgrowth of that.
Yeah.
I think they said that.
That they're rooted out and ousted from power.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be blamed, really, for these underperformances. And then once they're out of power, machines consolidate power again. They're free to do whatever they need to do to protect humanity.
It's sort of gently done, though. On 223, it's like, the machine is shaking the boat very slightly, just enough to shake loose those few which cling to the side for purposes the machines consider harmful to humanity. So Sayana, I probably pronounced that wrong, loses his factory and gets another job. He can do no harm. It's not like throwing people in prison, throwing away the key. It's just sort of like, okay, and then you're not gonna
like shaking off a fly or something.
Right. Like, yes, exactly. Like, just get you out of a place where you could do harm.
Right.
So that we can, minimize this threat.
Yeah, she has so much faith in the machines that she's willing to just say, well, we won't understand every little movement they make.
Right.
But we must trust that in the end it will be for our greatest benefit.
She's explaining that to Robot Byerly,
Yeah, it's interesting that she has a better understanding in some ways. If we're to believe what she says is true, she has a better understanding of how the machines work than he does, and he is a robot.
Yes.
But he's not one of the machines.
Right.
They're very different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have access, because this is a much broader, so the first law then zoomed out and then applied to all of humanity. And then, the pros for that would be like, how would we benefit everyone, which is not at all of obviously how the world works right now, where people have vastly different, lives and access to resources based on the quirk of where you were born.
So in this story, more than the others, we really see his vision of you have the machines, which are sort of the super intelligence, and then you have robots, which are more, they're like grunts, they're workers. Right. They're not necessarily built to have the super intelligence that the machines have. So he sees computers and robots as separate things.
Right.
Which is interesting to me, because I think we sort of see them all as an artificial intelligence. It's kind of all the same thing.
Right. It's like he's distinguishing between the hardware of a robot, and then this is more of a software type of thing. It's very different. It's just a lot of science fiction, as we all know, is like the machines are going to destroy us, and this is maybe not.
This is the opposite.
Yeah.
If we program them correctly, which it seems like he believes in this story we did,
yes,
then we're in the best hands possible. And we might not understand all of their little movements, but we have to understand that we'll be better off for them.
It's like the vision of world cooperation, not without its tensions between the four regions.
Interesting that they have these hangovers from because there would be,
of course,
there'd be animosities,
yes,
tensions, there'd be history not easily forgotten, and I think Byerly is right to suspect those tensions being the cause of these issues. He's wrong in the end, because Calvin kind of proves him wrong and is like, no, actually, this is all part of the plan. But I think he's right to suspect that anything going wrong with the system is because of human squabbles, because that makes sense. That's always been the case in the past.
It is, yeah. It's like the Society for Humanity is an issue. The robots are just gently nipping in the bud.
Yeah.
Without hurting anyone or even like making it so somebody can't make a living, but just, okay, you can't be in that factory, or you need to be out of here.
Gentle parenting.
Gentle parenting.
Yeah.
Such an optimistic
it is
vision.
And kind of refreshing. Again, it's like I'm just so used to these nightmarish visions of artificial intelligence. It's almost nice to have a break and to imagine, like, no, there are really beautiful outcomes that are possible.
Yes.
Well, and we don't really know if they're possible, but theoretically possible.
Theoretically possible. Like, what are these machine intelligence that isn't encumbered by like centuries worth of like racist rhetoric that privileges some people's experiences over others,
right?
And that tolerates, oh well, a lot of people in the world will just have worse lives just because, and that's just fine. And that's kind of a shame about the movie, because then the movie is like, well, I don't want to say exactly the opposite, but very,
Very.
but from
different.
this story, we're supposed to entertain this provocative thought that maybe it would be better. Well,
Yeah.
look at what we do when we're in charge. We're fettered by all these things. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. It's an inspiring look.
Does this make you want to read more Asimov in the future? Would you
It
read
does.
the Foundation series based on this?
I would, yeah. I don't know. It's thought provoking. I enjoyed it. Yeah, I think we've been generous but fair readers. Where obviously this is a book from that is published in 1950, and there are clear signs of that. Even in this last story, where the woman who's the regional coordinator for Europe is like, a poor woman is doing the job. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I did.
Even acknowledging that, I just feel like it's very thoughtful.
But I think the ideas are still interesting, and especially this last story, I think it's just chock full of really interesting ideas, which actually, if you liked the last story, the Foundation books really explore the idea of psychohistory and the idea that massive movements of, the economy and politics can be sort of predicted and controlled.
Yeah, interesting.
It explores that in greater detail. Would recommend that to anyone who enjoyed iRobot if you haven't already read the Foundation books.
Yeah. Well, what about you? Would you revisit based on this book? Would you be eager to consume more Asimov?
I think not necessarily my exact cup of tea, but I really enjoyed the ideas. And again, really enjoyed the optimistic view of artificial intelligence, which is refreshing after so much doom and gloom.
Agreed.
So
Even though I believe in the doom and gloom.
you're a little bit of a doomer. I would say I walk the line right between them. There are days I wake up thinking this is the end of the golden era of technology, and it'll be a nightmare from now on. I also know that I'll be the first in line for these like robots that come and clean your house, and I'm going to be an early adopter, I think, of the home robot companion. In fact, I remember seeing iRobot back in 2004 when I was in high school, and I was like almost heartsick coming home from the theater, just knowing that I wasn't going to be able to have one of those ever, maybe, or for a really long time. I really wanted that robotic society. I wanted to have these robot friends, and I don't know.
I think I learned a very different lesson from that movie, which is that they might destroy us.
Well, the evil super intelligence, but Sunny, I would
Right.
say, is a great depiction of what robots could be for us.
Well, we have joked about this where, of course, Elle will be first in line to buy the robot.
Yeah.
And I'll be the first to speak at her funeral when the robot malfunctions.
Yeah.
And it just offs her. And then, and then people are like, well, it's a fluky early model. But
I think more likely it'll just be that the robots have more, they'll be making better social media content than me, and I'll lose my job like everybody else.
yeah, I mean, that could be my job too. And
Yeah, as a professor, absolutely. You're one of the first to go. I also just realized I painted myself as a big doomer there, and that's not necessarily how I feel. I'm very excited to see what happens with artificial intelligence. I'm also terrified.
the number of times it has lied to me, like to my face, makes me very terrified.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna end my official stance is that we're gonna be like the humans in WALL-E, like
Yeah.
vacant and inert.
And not talking to each other except through our screens.
Yeah, and then just kind of like
We don't understand our creations. Also
Right.
kind of similar to like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, if you've read that, where it's so far in
maybe
the
I have,
future
yeah.
that like the
Right.
people don't understand the machines anymore, and they don't understand their technologies. And
which is maybe where iRobot that last story would lead to a situation where depending on if the
absolutely.
robots decide an agrarian model is better with fewer
absolutely,
people.
we will have brain atrophy for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, if we outsource all of our thinking to machines.
It's true.
Yeah. Which, hey, that's a good way to wrap this up, because we're trying to avoid brain atrophy. We're trying to make ourselves read more and think more. And happy that you all joined us. And we'll pick the next book and see you next month. And that's a wrap on iRobot, the very first entry into this little science fiction book club of mine. I hope you enjoyed the chat and the book itself. I know I did. And if you'd like to vote on the next title, don't forget to head over to Patreon. The poll is currently live, so you can cast your vote, exert your influence. Thanks so much to the Patreon members for making this book club possible, to Grace Yost for the scintillating conversation, and to Tony Lindgren for helping put the video together. I can't wait to see what you guys pick for the next title. I'll probably be announcing that on Patreon and social media over the next couple days. There'll also be another discussion of the next book the last Saturday of April right here on YouTube again, so keep on the lookout for that. And otherwise, keep looking up, and I'll see you out there.